to sitting down on the cushion, then really it's up to us and what we do with our mind and how we train our mind. So it's important to know what it is that we're doing when we get down to it. So this is what we will be talking about over the next 5 days. And so actually we don't have that much time really, so I'd like to just kind of get right into it. And we'll begin these sessions with a short mindfulness meditation. So we'll do that for about 10 minutes at the beginning of each session. And then we will proceed to the actual teaching itself. So let's begin with that. So let's get the body settled in a comfortable meditation position with the back straight. Whether you're sitting in a chair or with the legs folded, doesn't really matter so much as long as the back is comfortably straight. And just letting your awareness pay attention to the different sensations arising throughout your body. And if you find any points of tension or discomfort, then using the out breath as an opportunity to gently soften and relax any places that feel tight. And we can take 3 deep breaths. And then simply allowing the breathing to rejoin its natural rhythm without forcing or manipulating the breath in any way, as we settle more and more deeply into the stillness and the silence. And settling the mind by releasing all concerns, hopes, and fears to do with the past and the future, and simply allowing our mind to rest happily in the present moment for this brief meditation. And having prepared our body and mind in this way, we can turn our attention to the breath, focusing on the physical sensations of the breath, either at the level of the abdomen, the stomach, or with the sensations of the air coming in and out of the nose. And simply allowing our awareness to rest there, observing the entire duration of the breath from beginning to end and on to the next, in a continuity of mindfulness. And if you find yourself distracted by sounds or thoughts, whatever it might be, then simply relax, release the distraction, and return your awareness to the breath again and again. And gently relaxing our awareness on the breath. As we begin now using this new focus to now investigate these different means of meditation. All right. So I'd like to say welcome again. It's been really nice to, sorry, just one second. Technical difficulties. All right, so it's really nice to welcome you here to Shita and to this 5-day course, and where we're really going to be looking at the different ways in which we meditate. What does it mean to meditate? How do we do it? And the various types of ways in which to do it. So actually, this is quite a lot to cover in 5 days, and really, I'm going to try and cover as much as I can in the given time. But obviously, I'll try to give you a nice overview, such that afterwards, if you are still curious about certain topics, at least you have a nice foundation, such that you'll be able to then do your own investigation, your own reading, but at least some kind of foundation, some kind of basis is there. So in particular, I thought I'd just like to give you a quick idea of what the 5 days are going to be about. So looking at the 5 days that we have in front of us, then I would like to begin today with simply giving a kind of an introduction, or really setting forth the foundation for everything that's going to come, in terms of talking about what is the mind in the first place, right? It is quite apt to say that actually everything about Buddhism really begins and ends with the mind. It is really a science of the mind. And so it is important in the beginning to know what it is that we are talking about when we say the mind, and what it is not, and so forth. And actually, through understanding more and more what the mind is, we also come to understand what it is that we're trying to change, what it is that we're trying to work with. And so this is something very, very important to get right in the beginning. And then on top of that, I'll be speaking also on the what are called the Four Noble Truths. Yes. So the Four Noble Truths really encapsulate the very foundation of everything that Buddhism is really about. It was the first teaching given by the Buddha here in India, in Sarnath, and it really talks about the very framework of what is the whole Buddhist project about. What it is that we're trying to do, what is the goal here, what does it mean to attain enlightenment, and what does it mean to work on oneself, and so forth. So this is what I will be addressing today, these two topics. And tomorrow we'll actually go into the main kind of topic of meditation itself, in terms of understanding what meditation is and what it is not, and looking at various types of meditation in different ways in which they are categorized, and the way that they are used to different effects. Some being used to stabilize the mind, some being used to gain insight about certain things, and so on and so forth. There's very, while we say meditation is one word, but there's actually thousands and thousands of different ways to meditate. So even if we don't know all the thousands and thousands, at least we know some of the main techniques, or some of the main groupings under which they can be subsumed. And by knowing this and how they work, we really can put them to the best use when we're sitting down to meditate. So then, having these kind of tools under our belt, we can move on to what I kind of like to call the 3 routes to happiness. Because as we will see, some of you who have maybe heard about the Four Noble Truths before know that the first noble truth is the truth of suffering, which might sound quite pessimistic, but really we're talking about, bringing suffering to an end and generating genuine happiness, which comes from the mind. Yes, we'll talk more about this in a minute. But then flipping the coin on the other side, we want to talk also about happiness. And what does it mean, what does happiness actually mean in the first place? And once we understand that meditation is a tool to change and to develop our mind, then what are the various routes? What are the various methods? What are the various techniques that lead us to various types or levels even of happiness? So while this is by no means kind of a very classical way to present it, I find it a very useful way to categorize these things, especially when it comes to thinking about the types of meditations themselves. And we will see that in short, most meditations fall under one of these three routes of kind of routes to happiness, because they fulfill different functions in the mind that lead to different levels of happiness. So the first one being meditating on shamatha, developing shamatha, what's called calm abiding, which means developing a very concentrated mind. So in dependence upon reducing the mental distraction that we have on a daily basis and really developing a very strong sense of focus and concentration, there's a very deep sense of mental calm and happiness that is generated through that. Then going a level further, especially if we base ourselves on a mind that has some concentration developed in it already, then we can move on to actually practicing what is known as Vipassana or Vipassana in Sanskrit. And in the West, most commonly said as special insight or simply just analytical meditation. And here, we're really trying to use the more analytical part of the mind to investigate things, seeing how most of what causes our mental distress, our mental suffering, comes from the mind itself. And we will look at this more later on. Then actually it is also within the mind's power to work on the mind, to eliminate these mental disturbances, using analysis, using logic, using our own experience to learn from it and change the mind, change the way that we see ourselves and reality, and have a much more conducive way to perceive ourselves and the world around us. And again, through this, through being able to develop a more realistic way of seeing ourselves and seeing reality, there's a great sense of happiness, a great sense of mental happiness that comes as a result of that. And finally, on the fifth day, we'll be looking at what I've just kind of called the compassion type of meditation, the compassion wing it's sometimes called, which is the groupings of meditation really concerned with opening the heart and focusing, lessening our focus upon ourselves, always thinking me, and instead trying to turn the mind outwards and to try to focus more upon others with a sense of love and compassion, joy, and equanimity. And as we'll see, actually, even this is seen as actually the highest form of finding happiness in the mind. Because actually, we know this sometimes from experience that when we're really focused upon helping others or thinking about others, then actually our own mental suffering, our own suffering, somehow doesn't seem as big anymore. It has a very good effect of calming that down. So actually, through being able to make the mind more other-focused, outwardly focused upon others with a sense of love and compassion, it generates a great sense of mental peace for ourselves as well. It is often said, the Tibetans will often say that, we practice compassion and we always say compassion is for the benefit of others. But actually the first person to benefit from compassion is oneself. So like that. So we'll be looking at these three different kind of categories of meditations in the coming days. And we will see how each of them in turn works to really develop the mind in a variety of ways that allows us to generate various types of happiness. How do I turn off the... There we go. Right. So today, let's begin with looking at, first of all, what is the mind? And then focusing upon the Four Noble Truths, or at least just trying to get a basic idea of it. Because I'm hoping some of you, if not all, most of you have attended some of these teachings in Dushita before, or maybe you've read some books, so you might be a little bit familiar with what this is all about, but it's still good just to have a nice foundation anyway. So let's begin with the first kind of question, which is, what is the mind, right? What is it that we're talking about when we talk about training the mind and developing certain aspects of the mind? So, good news that actually, when it comes to Buddhism, then this is really the Buddhist specialty, right? When we're talking about Buddhism, even though a lot of the, especially with Tibetan Buddhism, a lot of things that you might see have a lot to do with external kind of trappings. I mean, you can just look behind me and you can see all the water bowls, the flowers, the statues, and very many different things like that. But actually, these are all tools, and these are all ultimately being used to develop the mind, to train the mind. And so it's really, Buddhism is really a science of the mind, really looking deep to see how does our mind work? How does our mind function? And trying to see whether things can be better, whether we can change things for the better through various types of, as we say, meditation. And this is actually incredibly important, right? Because if we really think about it, while we live in a very materialistic world, we are very outwardly oriented most of the time with our food and our drink and our Netflix and all these kind of things. But actually, everything that we experience, right? Everything that we're experiencing through the medium of our mind, right? So whether we're looking at something, whether we're hearing something, if we're thinking about something, all of that is actually the function of consciousness. It is the function of our mind that is, our eyes are, seeing is more than just what a camera does. The camera here is kind of, you could say it's kind of seeing in a way, it's kind of recording, it's doing something which is similar to the eye, but being actually conscious of what we're seeing and then forming thoughts and concepts on the basis of that is something that is again, it's the domain of the mind. So the first thing to understand is that when we're talking about the mind here, we're not talking about the brain, right? And this is a whole, debate and a whole issue that we could spend, we could spend the whole course talking just about that. But it is important to understand that, when Buddhists at least talk about the mind, they're not talking about the brain. The two are very much interdependent. They very much depend upon each other because the type of brain we have will determine the type of mind and mental functions that we have, So while the monkeys outside who are playing will have a certain type of mentality and conceptuality, and that is dependent upon their brain and the way that they perceive their environment and their senses, all of that plays hand in hand with the way that their mind is able to perceive and create a picture of their own reality. And in dependence upon that comes a certain behavior. And likewise, the dogs, the horses, all the different types of animals, and likewise us as humans. We have a certain sensory apparatuses with the eyes, ears, tongue, and so forth. But they are really simply windows onto the physical world, which then is processed by what we kind of call the sixth mind, which is the mental consciousness, right? So we have the five main consciousnesses, all to do with the senses, right? We have the sense of sight, hearing, taste, smell, touch. But then we have the sixth consciousness, which is the thinking mind, the mind that analyzes, the mind that thinks, that is able to dream, that is able to analyze about the future, to fantasize, to remember, all these mental functions that are not directly linked to the senses, and yet are working hand in hand to create some kind of conceptual framework based on our experience, based on our past experience and our logical thinking. So like that. But there is a difference being drawn here between the mind itself and the brain. So the mind itself, if we would like to define it, is really that which is experiencing, right? Or really, it is that which it knows. And knows in a very kind of broad sense of the word, in a sense of experience, of awareness, of cognizance, right? Of knowing what it is like, knowing what is something. And so actually the mind is the domain in which we have all the various types of experience, and we create our own thoughts and experiences from those. And that is something that we can then change, because that is something that is private to us. It is in our hands to what we do with it, right? It is often said that, actually our mind is our true home, because this is where we live 24 hours a day. Whatever it is we're doing, wherever it is that we're going, we're always experiencing everything with our mind, with our senses, which in turn are all dependent upon this mental consciousness, the thinking consciousness, which we use to analyze it, which we use to think about it, which we use to make sense of it. But we never think to really analyze the analyzer, right? We never really tend to think about, is the picture that this mind is painting of reality for me really that accurate in the first place, right? I mean, you know, when we look around and we see everything and we like things, we don't like things, but behind all of that, there's a certain assumption that whatever it is that we're seeing, whatever it is that we're perceiving, it is somehow ready-made. It is already there waiting to be discovered. And it kind of exists in the very way that we perceive it, right? There's a certain implicit, decision that whatever we experience is the correct reality, right? That, oh, I like this, therefore it's good. And it's even reflected in the way that we speak sometimes. So really here we're trying to look at the mind itself, at the experience, at the thinker, and pay attention to what it is that it is doing. Because if we really start looking, then it is actually something quite shocking, and especially in the beginning when we start looking and we see, getting back to the home analogy, we think, oh, this is my home, this is where I spend most of my time, but actually it's filled with junk, right? Our mind is just so filled with junk and things that we don't need, and all this excess baggage and so many things that are just getting in the way. And we never think to open a window, we never think to clean out the place. We just think this is the way things are, and we just have to live with it, right? So this is the way kind of to think about it, that we're really dealing with this mind, this mind which we're using to experience everything, and really taking a look at how it works and whether we can clean things out a little bit, right? So again, it's not the brain, it is something that is conscious, it is something that is separate from the brain from the Buddhist point of view. But again, we're not going to get into a whole debate about this right now. So, I mean, if you wish to think about it in terms of rewiring your brain and so forth, I mean, that's fine. It kind of serves the same function in a way, right? Whether you believe that the mind is simply the brain or you believe that the mind is something else, I mean, for the beginner level, and actually quite, getting along a bit as well, then, if you're thinking, oh, I'm reprogramming my brain, I mean, as long as you're using the correct techniques and using it properly, I don't think there's such a huge difference in the beginning. So that's fine. All right. So then what is it about the mind that is so important? So the first thing to understand is something very, very basic, but which we rarely really think about in terms of the way that the mind and our experience and our being operate. And that is that one very basic quality of the mind, one basic characteristics of the mind is that the mind, or us, we can say as an extent of that, we're always wishing for happiness, and we're always wishing to avoid or eliminate suffering, right? That sounds kind of obvious, but at the same time, it is something very important to pay attention to, because actually from the moment we wake up and the moment we go to sleep, and even in our dreams, right? Every action that we are doing, whatever it is that we're doing, whatever it is that we're thinking about, is either directly or indirectly involved in this quest, in this project of trying to attain some level of happiness. Doesn't matter how high or low the level is. I mean, we brush our teeth because we don't want tooth decay. So, I mean, it's not a huge thing that we're aiming for, but it still has some kind of seeking of happiness and elimination of suffering. So everything that we're doing is aimed at that, directly or indirectly. We're aiming for happiness, and we're aiming to eliminate our suffering. Now, the problem comes when we think about how we go about doing that. What are our methods for actually trying to attain this happiness and trying to eliminate the suffering? Because as we will see a little bit later on in more detail, most of our efforts tend to be directed outwardly, right? We are incredibly preoccupied with trying to rearrange the external world so we can kind of create a lovely, perfect little bubble for ourselves. Sound familiar, right? I mean, we mainly try to think about the things that we see, whether it is, beautiful sights, going traveling, or whether it's just looking at something on Netflix, right? We like to hear beautiful sounds with music. We like eating beautiful, very tasty food, smells, touches. All these different sensory experiences tend to occupy the vast majority of our time, right? So we tend to think of them as somehow very important for our well-being. And while they, I'm not knocking these things. I'm not saying, okay, let's do away with chocolate and ice cream, but rather that we pay too much attention to the external world, and so that we are actually chasing something which is really kind of unattainable when we really investigate it more deeply. We'll get back into that in a minute. But the main idea is that we tend to follow these desires of wishing for happiness and not wishing for suffering, mainly on the basis of the external world, right? But the external world can only supply us with these very kind of basic sensory experiences, right? Even the most kind of transcendental sunset or the best sex or whatever you can think of, really at the end of the day can be broken down into a set of physical experiences, whether we're dependent on sight, sound, smell, taste, whatever. They're a basic set of experiences which, then the mind, the sixth mind, the mental consciousness, then runs away with, basically. And we'll see how that works again later on. This introduction is taking very long, sorry. So we base ourselves on these kind of very basic, quantities of physical experiences, thinking that they're going to kind of solve all these problems for us. That although we have all this problem with suffering, somehow by rearranging this world in a particular configuration, somehow we'll get rid of that suffering. Or we want all this happiness, we want to be happier and happier and happier and happier. And somehow if we're able to rearrange this perfect little bubble, then we'll be able to attain that happiness somehow at the end. But it's not it's a losing war, and we'll see why in a minute. But that's just one of the basic ideas to get one's head around, that that we are always wishing for happiness. That's what the mind is chasing for. And actually that's kind of the natural state of the mind. From the Buddhist point of view, once we're able to get rid of all this junk that is disturbing our mind, the natural state of the mind is a very calm and peaceful and happy mind. It is only because we have all these different mental states that agitate us and convince us that we're not good enough, that actually we need all these external things, then the mind gets worked up, it gets agitated into this unhappy state. So we can think about the search for happiness as actually the mind's natural expression of wishing to get back to its natural happiness, its natural purity, it's sometimes called in various contexts. And while the mind's wish to eliminate the suffering is actually a natural expression of it wishing to get rid of all these elements that are upsetting the mind, that are disturbing the mind, which we call anger and attachment, jealousy, pride, and so on and so forth. And again, we'll look at that in a lot more detail in the coming days. So, like that. So now when we look a little bit more deeply into this happiness and suffering that we wish for, to eliminate, then we can make two broad categories with respect to these. So we can see that on the one hand we have the physical happiness and suffering, while on the other hand we have mental happiness and suffering. This is a very important division to get one's head around in the beginning, because we tend to kind of confuse the two. It's kind of strange to think of, leg pain as we think of it as something very physical. So it's weird to think about it as an experience, as part of the mind. It is still something mental, because it is an experience, but it is very closely tied with our physical sensory apparatus. And so it would still be categorized as a physical type of suffering. Whereas, and then likewise with happiness, whenever we have lovely chocolate cake, we really like chocolate cake, then of course it's a wonderful feeling. But it is something that is kind of a physical happiness, right? Even though it's an experience, and experience is by nature part of the mind, it is still something which is triggered by a certain kind of physical sensory stimuli, right? Whereas we have the mental happiness and suffering, which are quite different. They can also be influenced by the physical, but at the same time, they are somehow a little bit more independent, right? And these, when we're talking about mental happiness, we really can think about being just content, being very happy and content. And we can think about mental suffering as things like depression or being very angry. You know, that kind of mind which is very angry can be very disturbing, right? But they're very, very different. They're very different types of experiences. And it's nice to sometimes in meditation try to analyze and see whether we can see the difference between, the qualitative difference between these types of experiences. And what's more, the mental happiness and suffering, the mental level of things, is actually far more important than the physical level of things, right? Why is that? Well, actually, we know this from very basic experience, right? That actually, you know, if our mind is unhappy, right? If we're really unhappy, we're having a really horrible day, we're really depressed, we're really, just something is not right, you know, or if, you know, God forbid, if a relative dies or something really tragic happens like that, and where our mind is just overcome with suffering, then no amount of ice cream will help, right? No amount of, you know, someone trying to console us will help. Sometimes, you know, all these kind of external things which would normally give us happiness suddenly lose their effectiveness, right? All the lovely food, all the lovely sights, you know, they kind of lose their effectiveness because the power of that unhappy mind is so much more forceful, right? That it is not able to be overcome by these external stimuli. Likewise, in the opposite direction, if we're very happy, if we're having a very wonderful day, right? Then also if things kind of go wrong, right? We don't take it as hard as we usually do, right? So even if we're facing some very difficult situations, we're facing some very difficult people, then actually if our mental state is very calm, is very peaceful, then we're able to handle it in a much more constructive way. It doesn't jar us as much, it doesn't shake us up as much, and we're able to take it on the shoulder, as it were. We're able to really deal with it in a much more constructive way. So we can already see how, in this way, the mental happiness and suffering is kind of much more important. And what's great about it is actually that level of suffering and happiness is in our hands. It's in our hands because it is our mind, right? And so it is within our capacity to be able to transform our mind and to be able to develop the mind such that it is able to deal with levels of mental unhappiness and slowly eliminate them, and be able to generate this mental happiness to become the very kind of the default setting, if you will, that we have a very calm, happy, and peaceful mind, whatever it is that might be happening around us, right? So, like that. So it is a very nice thing to think about, and I hope that you take time to think about it in more detail, that, you know, these two different levels of happiness and suffering, and how they have different effects upon the mind, and how we react to the external world around us. Because they also amplify things, yeah? So we talked about how each affect the opposite, right? But actually, they also amplify their own side. For example, when we're having a very nice day, then everything seems nicer, right? When the mind is happy, you know, if you're having a really wonderful day, suddenly the birds are singing, the sky is blue, everyone is being really nice to you, everything's wonderful, right? Whereas if you're having a really crappy day and you're really miserable and annoyed, suddenly everyone's miserable and annoyed. Oh, how dare that person do this? And yeah, the weather these days. And suddenly everything becomes kind of more miserable, right? So it is really incredible to see the power that our mind has in actually deciding how we experience these things. So that is an important thing to look at. All right. So now with that as our kind of jumping point, I would like to quickly move on to a quick overview of the Four Noble Truths, right? And again, we have very little time to do this, but I'll try my best in that this is really the kind of the journey that the Buddha initially suggested, in terms of, now that we see that we are in a situation in which we wish for happiness, we don't wish for suffering. So what do we do? And so it was kind of the Buddha who originally asked these, he kind of laid forth the Four Noble Truths, but in a sense, there are four types of questions which the Buddha is inviting us to think about and investigate, which of course can be a many lifetimes project. So as we know, so many of you might have heard that the Four Noble Truths are the truth of suffering, the truth of a cause of suffering, or the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path. I think I have this for you here. There we go. So focusing on these two lines at the moment. So the truth of, when we're saying about the truth of suffering, then really it's getting us to ask the first type of question, which is, what is suffering, right? We say, oh, I don't want to suffer, I don't want this, I don't want that. But what really is suffering? What is it that we're talking about when we're talking about suffering? And conversely, it also applies, what does it mean when we talk about happiness? When we say, oh, I want to be happy, what do we really mean by that? I just want 5 minutes of happiness when I eat the chocolate cake and that's fine? Well, no, we're talking about something a little bit deeper than that. So the first kind of question, or the first investigation, is to really understand what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about happiness and suffering. And in particular, in this case, when we're talking about suffering, then next we ask the question of, okay, so we are suffering, so then why do we suffer, right? What brings about our suffering? Where does it come from? Because again, if we notice that we have these various types of suffering and we don't like suffering, so it would be good to get to the bottom of why it is that we're suffering, to really see if, what is the cause, like getting a diagnosis for the problem, to really see what is causing, what is behind the various suffering that we are experiencing right now. Then once we understand a little bit more about why we suffer, what are the causes of our suffering, then the next thing we naturally want to know is, well, can we put a stop to suffering, right? So I mean, this is a very big question, and sorry, spoiler alert, but the Buddhist answer is yes, we can, right? And we'll talk about why a little bit in a minute. So and so if yes, then if we can put a stop to suffering, how do we do that, right? How do we put a stop to suffering? So then this is when actually when we call the truth of the path is actually talking about the different ways in which we meditate, the different ways in which we transform our mind to eliminate these causes of suffering and develop these causes of happiness, right? So this is just kind of the basic framework that we are working with, these kind of four questions that encapsulate, in a way, the whole Buddhist project, right? Because again, if the very basic nature of the mind is to wish for happiness and to not want suffering, then these are the only four questions that are really that important when we get right down to it. So let's start thinking a little bit about these, and especially in terms of the first one. Let's see. There we go. So when we talk about suffering, right, and by extension also happiness, then really again, since the mind is always wishing to be happy and always not wanting to suffer, then we have to think about what kind of happiness do we really want, right? And so actually we don't really, if we really try to investigate and we ask ourselves, okay, is my life goal, is really my ultimate goal here the kind of happiness that I get from eating a lovely chocolate cake? Is that the type of happiness I'm looking for? Then we might be, well, not really, right? We're looking for something more than that. And if we keep investigating down this rabbit hole of trying to investigate, well, what kind of happiness are we looking for? Then we actually come to see that the type of happiness that we want is kind of what we might say the ultimate happiness, right? The genuine happiness that again is from the Buddhist point of view, the natural state of our mind, but it's simply the happiness that is kind of forever and ever, right? The happiness that doesn't go away, the happiness that is a sense of being satisfied, of being happy, in a sense of being content and well, right? So, so again, we can think about this in terms of dividing happiness into two different types here. First one being the happiness, which we might call stimulus-based happiness versus genuine happiness, right? So when we talk about stimulus-based happiness, then we're talking about, again, everything that depends upon the senses, like we spoke before. Anything that depends about looking at beautiful things, listening to beautiful music or sounds, or people talking to us, tasting nice food, smelling nice scents, and so on and so forth. And so, there we go, sorry. So while we are very used to seeking happiness in this kind of a way, actually, when we think about it, it is not a very satisfying way of finding happiness. If you really think about what's kind of wrong with it, then we see that actually, while we want a happiness that is long-lasting, is permanent, we want a genuine, lasting happiness that leaves us truly content, the very nature of this type of happiness is that it is changing. It is something very temporary. It is something that is not stable. Why? Because it is based upon some kind of external stimulus, right? In order to have a pleasant experience based on eating the chocolate cake, we need the chocolate cake. So what's wrong with that? Well, the chocolate cake finishes, right? Not only that, our stomach gets full, right? And so actually, if we investigate these things, then actually there's a very impermanent, something very unstable kind of a stimuli, which is the condition for generating this very temporary experience of happiness. Or we can just call it pleasure even. But the minute the fuel for that is gone, right? The minute the stimuli exhausts itself, runs out, then so does that pleasurable feeling, right? And it's kind of like that with most of these types of experiences. Whether it is sights or sounds, these are all based on phenomena which are by nature impermanent. They keep changing, and they, by their very usage, they finish, they run out. Yeah. So, so what happens is that while we use them, we're happy, we're lovely. Oh yes, it's a very lovely meal, it's a very lovely movie, it's a very lovely this, it's a very lovely relationship, whatever. But then things change. Things change in a way that they no longer are able to supply that same level of happiness that they did before, just due to their nature of change. And so then we need something else to replace it, right? And so again, it becomes this whole process of continually having to rearrange the external world again and again and again, jumping from one thing to the other. All right? So we spend our time, okay, now we're eating lovely food, now we listen to this, now we watch this, now we do that. And we keep having to jump from one activity to the next, because doing one continuously actually doesn't provide that lasting type of happiness that we're looking for. You know, we utilize one and then it finishes, and then we have to utilize another one and then it finishes, and it becomes a cycle whereby we're continually jumping from one to the other, and again we're trying to rearrange the external world to basically never have to run out of all these things that give us pleasure, right? So and the point is that rearranging this external world based on our desires is, like I said before, it's a losing battle. Because while we think we have a great deal of control over what we do and how we, the things around us, the reality is that when we really think about it, we really come down to it, we have very, very little control in the matter. We have very little control over what other people do and say. We have very little control about even the things that we enjoy, right? We want to watch Netflix, but the internet's not working, right? I really wanted that beautiful chocolate cake, but the cook didn't wash his hands, I got food poisoning, right? So we have very little control about these things. So even the very things that can usually give us happiness can actually turn out to be causes of suffering. But not only that, they are, it is a kind of a never-ending chase for these things, which always leaves us unsatisfied. And if you then analyze what is the reason for that, well, it's actually because these things are not really in the nature of happiness in the first place, right? What do I mean by that? If something is in the nature of happiness, if something is really the cause of happiness, you know, consuming this thing, consuming this chocolate cake is a true, genuine cause of happiness, if that were the case, then the more chocolate cake you eat, the happier you would be, right? It just stands to reason. That's just pure logic right there, right? But, you know, we can test that out very easily. You know, you can all do this as homework if you like. You know, you can sit down and you can, you know, try your chocolate cake. You can have the first piece and it's very lovely. You know, you have your second piece and it's okay. And, you know, the third piece is a bit, whew, you know, and then you get to the fourth and the fifth and the sixth. And, you know, if you make it that far, right? And what actually begins as a source of happiness can actually transform itself into a source of misery, of a great deal of suffering, right? You're getting to that 10th piece and you're just like, I don't even want to look at it, right? So what is happening there is that, again, these things we have very little control about these things. And actually, in order for that stimuli to be able to generate this very minute, this very short-term sensation of happiness, so many different causes and conditions have to come into place, right? The chocolate cake has to be good, right? So the cook must have, you know, prepared it well. They didn't burn it. They used fresh ingredients, right? Then, you know, it shouldn't be too old, so it didn't go stale. Then, you know, so that's from the side of the cake, but then also from our side, we have to be hungry, right? If we're not hungry, if we just had a huge meal, we look at that chocolate cake, it's like, no, right? So we have to be hungry. You actually have to be someone who likes chocolate cake in the first place, right? And so maybe there's nuts in it, you're allergic to nuts, who knows, right? So if we really start thinking down this road, there are so many different causes and conditions that have to come together, right? All these things which have to align up exactly in order for us to just have this instance of happiness. And then it starts to decline, right? Because in its usage, it exhausts itself, right? The very thing that we are using to generate that pleasant experience is running out, like that. So like that. So we can see that in this way, and I'm just using an easy example with the chocolate cake, but in your spare time, you know, you can think about this in terms of whatever it is that kind of, whatever turns you on, baby, right? I mean, whether it's Netflix, whether it's, you know, going on, you know, traveling, doing this, doing that, whatever things that, you know, whatever objects of the five senses, which really for you have, you know, a certain kind of unhealthy relationship with, then really to try and analyze them and see how much, how that whole experience is very participatory, right? It depends upon us as much as it depends upon that. And then it is very temporary. We experience it and it's finished, right? And then we have to go for something else. So this is a kind of loop then that we get stuck in, to say that, okay, then the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and we're not able to stand still, right? Because the moment we stand still, then the happiness declines again. And this is because we are basing ourselves purely, we see a happiness as equal to this stimulus-based happiness, which again is something that really depends upon the external world. So now, if it's not the external world that we're looking for this kind of, what we said, the other category of happiness, the genuine happiness, then what is? What are we looking for? So then this is where the Buddhist project, again, looks inwards, right? That it is actually within the mind, that, again, we're talking about the way in which the mind participates in the creation of our experience, in the creation of everything that we say and do and think 24 hours a day. And so while the external world is a condition for our experiences, no one's dismissing the external world completely. But as we saw, the internal happiness and suffering, the internal world being so much more overpowering if we're, when we get down to it, and if we're able to gain a certain level of control over that internal world, right, then it is much more powerful than having to chase all these external ephemeral things. So that is kind of the project in a very brief nutshell. So, because then when we look inwards, what is it that is keeping us from experiencing this very natural, genuine happiness of the mind? Then we see that it is the various mental states, the junk of the mind, which are getting in the way, right? Because this kind of attitude that I've been discussing with all the chocolate cake and all this is a kind of mental attitude which, the Buddhists would call attachment, right? Not the way it's defined in biology and so forth. It has its own very specific definition, which we'll talk about in a few days' time. But we get really obsessed with these things, and our desire for those things become really unrealistic. It totally loses touch with reality. And then when we don't get what we want, we get really angry, we get irritated, we get, quarrelsome. And on top of that, we have jealousy for those who are doing better than us, competitiveness, all these different pride, all these different negative mental states, which really disturb the mind and actually are getting in the way of us being able to really develop this kind of calm, peaceful state of mind, which would be conducive to our happiness, to our long-term happiness, right? So then the question really becomes, then what do we do about this? Can we really eliminate these different states of mind, such as, these non-conducive states of mind, this anger, this attachment, all these states of mind which are standing in the way of our happiness, which are fooling us into thinking that the external world is the source of all of our problems and it's the source of all of our happiness, and neglecting the internal world, right? Well, so can we do something about this to eliminate these kind of roadblocks, these mental roadblocks? Well, the short answer is yes, right? And just because we don't have a lot of time, so the answer is yes, because again, this is a very different viewpoint than what we would generally see as a Western psychological point of view, where a healthy human being is someone who has a little bit of anger, a little bit of love, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and all these different, a healthy balance of all these things makes a happy, let's say, a healthy individual. Whereas from the Buddhist point of view, we're all nuts, right? We're all crazy, because we allow minds like anger and attachment and pride and jealousy to just run rampant in the mind. And the problem with these minds is that they completely misrepresent reality to us. Yeah? The moment they arise, they completely disturb our mind because they completely distort reality. And then we're fighting with hallucinations, right? Because we create, when we're angry, that person who we're angry at is 100% negative and wrong and bad, and get rid of them, yeah? Whereas actually no one's 100% bad and negative and like that. And so not only does it completely distort reality and not allow us to see the situation for what it really is, based on such distorted views, we act crazy, right? We think that, the punch in the face is the correct way to do things, when, when does violence, ever lead to anything positive, right? Violence only begets violence. So it leads us to a type of behavior based on these very wrong states of mind, minds which are completely misrepresenting reality for us, to engage in all these different erroneous, unproductive ways that then lead to our own suffering, right? And this is the kind of loop that we get stuck in, which finds its origin in these destructive states of mind, these so-called afflictions or disturbing emotions, or they're called by different types of names. But all of them share this quality of misrepresenting reality for us. So now, since they misrepresent reality, since there's something wrong with the way in which they perceive reality, then we can come to correct them, right? Because again, if we take the example of, if I think the world is flat, right? well, I know that's making a comeback these days for some reason, but I mean, just put that aside. If I think the world is flat, that is a wrong idea. That is a wrong perception of the world, right? And so, but on the basis of that, I might do all sorts of crazy things. Like I might want to go on a tourist trip to go photograph the edge of the world, or jump off, or do, I don't know, all sorts of crazy ideas and depends on that. However, you know, using logic and using experience, different types of ways of proving the opposite of that, proving that actually the world is round, right? Then it automatically disproves the idea, the hypothesis, the proposition that the world is flat, right? Because the mind cannot hold those two contradictory ideas in the mind at the same time. It is impossible to think the world is flat and the world is round at the same time. So they are mutually destructive, right? One will destroy the other. And since the world is round, has evidence and experience on, backing it up, it has a grounding in reality, and then over the long term, it will always win out over the incorrect mind, right? So again, this is a huge discussion which we could be having over that, but just to get the basic idea that since it is a mind that is, getting something wrong with respect to reality, and we have a mind that is able to know, it is able to investigate, able to analyze, we can come to know the truth. And the moment we know the truth, it will eliminate the mind which is erroneous, because the erroneous mind and the correct mind cannot exist in the mind at the same time. So this kind of process that I'm now describing is kind of in a very brief nutshell what we're going to be talking about over the next few days, because actually this is what meditation is for, right? Meditation is the very process by which we try to probe the mind. We try to analyze the way that our mind sees ourselves and sees reality, and how these different minds interact with reality, and how we react to these different states of mind. Where the basic idea of the meditation itself is to then bring some kind of mental transformation within the mind, such that as much as we can, we try to reduce these negative, erroneous states of mind, and we try to increase and strengthen the positive states of mind, the previous of which are the causes of our suffering, our mental suffering and discomfort, and the latter of which, the correct minds, which are the causes of our happiness and well-being. And we do this through this process of meditation. So this is what we'll be diving into. So we've run a little bit over in terms of the question time as well, but I just thought it's important to get that foundation there right at the beginning, and then from tomorrow we can kind of go to the main schedule as it's written on the website. So we'll leave it there for now. And so if any of you have any questions, you can ask those through Felipe, and if not, then I'll hand it over to Felipe for the meditation. So Felipe?
There are questions for sure. So, and some of you have been asking 2 questions. We'll limit it to 1 question per person. The first one is from Sunil, who says, how can you sustain the calming effects of meditation?
So the question is, how can we sustain the calming effects of meditation? So yes, that's a very good question, right? But as we'll see more when we look more tomorrow about what meditation really means, meditation, the word itself, also has the connotation of familiarization, familiarizing the mind or something, or in other words, building up a habit building, right? So while especially in the beginning, the effects of the meditation, if we're meditating on our breath for a few minutes, and it has a very calming effect on the mind, but then we get up and we run around and we're busy all day, we kind of lose that. But slowly, through habituating the mind with that kind of mental state, which is calm and peaceful, then that habit grows stronger, right? So it is simply a matter of practice, simply a matter of trying to strengthen that quality of the mind through habituation of being calm and peaceful, and trying to reduce the countermeasures, which are the very frantic types of mind, and trying to deal with things in a more constructive manner. But over, the short answer being through habituation and practice and time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's one from Emilio, perhaps more of a clarifying one, asking
Mm-hmm.
about what is correct mental attention and what is true cessation.
Hello. So, so what is correct mental attention? What is true cessation? So, true cessation, let's begin with that. Very, very simply, is when we are able to, as I was just saying, these negative mental states of the mind are incorrect minds, right? But they keep coming back up again and again and again because we still carry around certain wrong views, or we still kind of believe in the lies that they're telling us. And so as long as we carry that around with us, they will keep resurfacing, right? We're not angry all the time, but when we meet with certain conditions, anger comes up all of a sudden. And it's because there's a certain view or a certain mental disposition which is carried around, which when it meets a certain condition, like that person who called us that name or took the last donut or whatever, and that condition acts as the straw that broke the camel's back, right? And anger erupts, and then we go through it. So the true cessation is the elimination of that kind of disposition, that through continued meditation, through continued work on the mind, we're able to completely eliminate that disposition in the mind to such an effect, to such an extent, that even if we meet the whatever condition it might be, we wouldn't get angry, for example, right? So so that is kind of in a very short way. So while on the way we are working to reduce anger, such that we will find that we get angered by fewer and fewer conditions, right? And it happens over a long time. You practice, and day to day it's not obvious, but after a very long time, you suddenly catch yourself in a situation where you think, you know what? A few months ago, that I would have got so angry about that. So the meditation is doing something, right? You see it over a long term, but eventually, through a continued work and a very intense process of transforming that view, one is able to get rid of that disposition altogether. And that elimination of that disposition is called a true cessation, because one has truly ceased, eliminated the very cause for anger to arise at all, in any time in the future. And from the Buddhist point of view, that is possible, and it's very healthy. Again, unlike the Western psychological point of view, it is a very healthy attitude, because it's not a suppression, right? It's not suppressing the emotion. It's just that it never occurs to you to get angry. It's a very natural kind of change to the mind. And then with respect to incorrect mental attention, we're going to speak a lot more about that and on the third and the fourth day. So I'm going to maybe leave it for now, and it's going to come up again. So don't worry about that. It's a very important topic, but we'll talk more about that in the coming days.
All right. I think we can do one more since we've been a bit over. This one is a bit similar to what you've talked about already, but perhaps it will help to bring it home. It says, I'm an introvert and my mind gets totally overwhelmed with the demands of full-time work, teenagers, and all the chaos they create. So the question is, how do I move past the external circumstances to develop calm for me and my family?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right? So yeah, I mean, to give you a full answer, I mean, that's going to come in the next few days, right? This is exactly what we'll be talking about. But in short, it is really about the continued practice, as I said. And we will see that through the various methods, like developing calm abiding, like using analytical meditations to kind of transform the mind, then while at first it seems like it's a very lovely little thing that we do on our cushion, and then suddenly we're back into the fray of things. But over time, it creates a natural, not resistance, but a natural kind of strength of the mind, which then is able to translate into our everyday lives, right? Such that it is kind of like going to the gym, right? And we lift all those weights and we run all those treadmills, and I don't know about you guys, I hate it. It's horrible, I find. But we don't lift weights to be able to lift more weights. Yeah, the idea of going to the gym is not to be able to spend more time in the gym, but it's rather to improve the state of our body. such then that the body is healthier and is able to better withstand disease, better withstand stress, and all the various health effects that come as a result of the exercise. So in a very similar way, the cushion is our mental gym, right? Because we go in and we meditate and we work on our mind in these various techniques that we will be talking about. And as a result, our mind naturally becomes more resilient. That was the word I was looking for. It becomes more resilient and it becomes stronger and more able to handle the external chaos, right? Such that actually, because also saying that it is chaos, saying that it is frantic, is a conceptualization of the mind. It's very natural, and it's just a reflection of how our internal mind is behaving. So by then, the external stuff, there's only a limited amount of control we can exercise over that. But the internal mind, the way that the mind reacts to the situation, we have full control over. So that is kind of the point, that day by day, slowly working on our mind, transforming the mind, gives us a stronger, more resilient mind, such that when we are then put in these situations which are frantic, which are chaotic, teenagers and the like, we're simply better equipped to handle these things. And if we're better equipped, like the example with, if our mind is very calm, peaceful, and we've got it together that day, it is much easier to take whatever the world throws at us, right? So that is kind of the goal, yeah. But it takes time and it takes practice, right? So not to expect instant results either. It is something that we develop over time. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Shahar. So shall we go to meditation now?
Yes.
All right, great. So
take
please
care,
everyone. Yep.
So take care, everyone, and I'll see you again tomorrow. I'll hand you over to Felipe.
Thanks. So please everyone set up your meditation posture, making sure that your back especially is loosely straight, that you can, settle down with the body. And we'll go right into the practice. And let's begin by taking a couple of minutes to allow the body to settle down back into its natural state. Getting rid of all the tension, all the tightness in the body. Which give rise to this sense of calmness, of relaxation. And you can take a few deep breaths in order to accomplish this briefly. Letting go of all the air in your lungs and then gently breathing in, fully and completely filling up the lungs. And then letting go, releasing the out-breath. Let the air flow naturally and uncontrived. And just settling down in that calmness. Also maintaining a sense of stillness. And yet remaining vigilant. We're not trying to fall asleep here, but we keep the attention present. And now that the body has settled down, we can actually let it rest in its natural state without paying much more attention to it. We'll let go of the realm of the physical. And now we'll start to think about some topics related to our happiness and how we seek happiness. So think how we're normally engaged with objects outside of us, how often we find that these objects, these people, these things are the source of our happiness. This is a habit that we develop since we're very young. Remember how in your childhood you basically depended on your parents as your source of protection, but also as your source of happiness. As a small child, we're pretty much dependent on our parents, but we seek every input of satisfaction and pleasure from them in terms of nourishment, in terms of love and affection, in terms of protection. We see them as the absolute source of our happiness. And then later on in life, perhaps we rebel against our parents and we find comfort and affection with our friends. Our social circle becomes the source of many joyful experiences. But at the same time, we think that once again, this is the source of our real happiness. But is it really? And some of us may have certain propensity to satisfy our needs or our cravings with food. Sometimes we feel stressed and feel that eating something is the only way to forget about our problems. Especially in times of distress or depression, we may start overeating, especially comfort foods. There's just some days where you think a milkshake will make me truly happy, or a pizza is my only source of joy right now. And so we believe that these external things will relieve the pain that we feel inside. And in that, can you see the difficulty wanting something outside of us to relieve something that is within. And perhaps the other side of the coin of that is when we become completely obsessed on having a healthy diet. We're basically controlling everything that we eat, making sure that we have the best ingredients, that everything needs to be organic, harvested in a particular time of the year, contain a certain amount of calories. We spend a lot of effort and resources on making sure our diets are as healthy as possible. And there's nothing really wrong with that, but the problem is we go and say, this will make me truly happy. But again, is that really the case? And we do the same thing with relationships, for example. Believing that this or that person will truly make me happy. Sometimes we have this feeling that if only I was able to get together with that person, then all the troubles in our life would disappear. But as many of you know, relationships are not free of problems. And oftentimes, they carry a lot of difficulties. Even if they're great while they last, eventually they have to end as well. So they cannot be the source of a reliable, unchanging happiness. So the same can be said about so many things that we chase in our lives. Think about music, intoxicants, work. For a few minutes, allow your mind to think about these objects that we chase after, these external things. that we're constantly wanting to get, thinking that they are the source of happiness, that they can constantly satisfy us. Come up in your own experience with as many examples as you can. There are so many things that we chase after, so many sensory pleasures that we crave. And underlying all of that, the thought that these things can actually bring us happiness. And momentarily they might bring some relief. But stop for a moment and ask yourself, actually, how many of these things have brought you true, unchanging, genuine happiness? How long did the pleasure that we get out of these things actually last? Considering food, a healthy diet, relationships, best friends, intoxicants, music, studies, or job, stop for a moment and ask, how much happiness have they really brought to your life so far? And how reliable are they? All of this are ways that we use to end our sufferings, but those are only temporary. We have tried all these things again and again in the past, and still we seem to encounter suffering. We're still not free of it. We still seem to encounter problems and difficulties. But we don't want to suffer anymore. If we wish to develop a kind, peaceful, and happy mind, the only way to do so is to stop looking outside of ourselves and turn our attention inward. A lasting and reliable source of happiness can be only something that comes from within. The only thing that can protect us from suffering, the source of our everlasting, unchanging happiness, lies within our own mind and heart. And by following the inner path, developing our inner qualities, qualities of wisdom, loving kindness, and compassion, we can achieve that genuine happiness that we all seek. So let that sink in, becoming disenchanted with all those external objects that don't seem to be able to provide lasting, genuine happiness. Developing the interest, the determination to go inside and to cultivate the causes for genuine happiness to arise. And gently coming out of the meditation. And now we move on to the last aspect of any practice within the context of Buddhism, which is to dedicate whatever positive potential we've created, whatever good energy has come forth from our actions, from our virtuous actions, that we don't just keep it for ourselves, but we offer it also so that it benefits others as well. So for this, we'll read from this beautiful prayer from Shantideva. And while we do it, simply imagine that any good energy that you created with this practice, with this session, goes out to all sentient beings who need it. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored and find repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the foreigner find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be free from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain, to dispel the mysteries of the world. All right. So that is that for this session. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you everyone for being here and sharing this meditation, this session. Hope to see you tomorrow, same time, same schedule, and that we continue to listen to these wonderful teachings and meditate together. Yeah. So have a lovely, lovely day, lovely evening, lovely morning, whatever it is, wherever you are. And yeah, see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.